Hello and welcome to Cymera, Britain's only book festival celebrating science fiction, fantasy and horror writing. My name is Anne Landman and I'm the festival's founder and artistic director. Right about now, I'd hope to be welcoming you to beautiful Edinburgh, to our venue The Pleasance, for a weekend packed with events. Writing workshop, panels, readings, open mics, a quiz, a ceilidh, 2 plays. We had so much in store for you. Thank you for joining us online instead, to be part of our programme from the safety of your homes. We're very excited to still bring you a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'd ask you that you support our speakers, and there's many ways you can do that. You can buy their books or borrow them from the library. You can donate to them directly via their Patreon or Ko-fi. You will find the links for that below in the description. We encourage you to buy a ticket for our events, even the pre-recorded ones. All ticket money will go directly to our speakers. You can also donate to the festival, and all donations via the donation page will be split between our speakers, once we've covered our costs like the Zoom account. Thank you again for joining us in this brave new world of digital events. We hope you have a chance to check out all 33 of ours over the weekend. Please let us know what you think of them. Do get in touch via social media, the chat function in Zoom, or drop us an email on info@chimerafestival.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year for Cymera 2021.
Okay, hello and welcome to Cymera 2020. Thank you all for turning out on this beautiful afternoon. And we're here. My name is Ken MacLeod. I'm a science fiction writer and I now live on the other side of Scotland from where Cymera is. And we're here to talk with Paul McAuley, another science fiction writer, and about his new novel, War of the Maps, which I'm holding up now.
Well, I can do that as well.
Yay, yay. And about life, the universe, and everything. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, I no longer live in Scotland, which I did in the 1990s. I'm now back in, well, not back in London, but I'm back in England. I'm in London specifically, in the half gloom of sheltering in place from the bizarreness that's going on in the great metropolis, and still staying healthy. I hope you are too, Ken.
Oh yes,
and
we are.
And we've managed to meet. We were supposed to meet elsewhere. Unfortunately, couldn't get out to Edinburgh, which is one of my favourite cities in the world. But here we are.
Oh, in a sense, we are living in a little war of the maps, and that it's a war between the genomes of viruses and the genomes of us, or rather, not so much the genomes as the immune systems of us. We're a bit like the Wells's Martian invader being struck low by the tiniest of organisms that God in his wisdom has put upon the earth, or that Father Darwin in his mindless twiddling has put upon the earth. So Paul, would you like to just introduce your new book and for the moment, and I will rave enthusiastically about it later.
Okay, well, what's to say about it? It's set several billion years in the future when the sun has become a white dwarf, and some sort of very, very post-human godlike creatures have built a inside-out Dyson sphere around it. Now, Dyson sphere is the kind of thing that advanced civilizations are supposed to build around suns to maximize, sponge up all the energy of the sun so they can maximize the utility of the light and heat for whatever purposes their very highly advanced civilization wants. These gods have built it around a white dwarf, and conveniently, if you do it around a white dwarf the right distance, you can live on the outside rather than the inside of the Dyson sphere. So the sun's at the center and the people are living on the outside at one gravity. And so it's a mini Dyson sphere. The gods, who aren't very good gods, by the way, built it as a kind of amusement park. They had a kind of nostalgia for the flesh, and lived there for a while and abandoned it and have kind of left the attractions, including the inhabitants, of the kind of planet-sized maps that are scattered across the globe. And on one of those maps is a Lucidor, a kind of law enforcement agent who's set out to look for one of his old enemies, who's absconded from prison. He's helping a rival nation with their war against a kind of biological invasion, not of viruses, but something similar, that's something transformative. And the Lucidor's one idea is to get this guy back in prison where he belongs, and then things get complicated.
As they do.
As
yes.
they do.
Yeah. And I, just to say, I have, last week, I took a couple of days to read this book because I knew we were talking about it. Thanks to Gollancz for sending me a copy. Your publicist at Gollancz for sending me a copy. I enjoyed it very much. It's very well-paced, sure-footed, and it has constant little eye kicks of wonder in it. And I have to say that as we were approaching the end, I got this moment of dread that it might be the first volume of something, because I couldn't see how you were going to pull off an ending, and you did. So I'm well impressed with that. It was a very effective landing, as it were. And
thank you, yeah. It's always difficult to get the endings right. And as you say, there's this tendency now to have like multiple, I mean, we've both been guilty of this, haven't we, but of doing multiple volumes. And because there's a lot of an effort to create a science fictional world, a world that's a slant to our own, but is recognizable and is also different from all the other science fictional worlds. You know, it takes a lot of imaginative output to do. So you want to get the sort of maximum out you can from that. And so the temptation is always to kind of spin the tale out these days. And I've kind of thought, actually, you know what you could do? I mean, the book is in 3 parts, so it's a kind of trilogy, but it's just one novel.
Yes,
So,
yes.
Yeah, 1-book trilogy.
And it does have the kind of slingshot ending that leaves open possibilities. But that's up to you.
Yeah, which leaves out the possibilities of going towards the original ending, which is why my editor said, "Are you going to write the next book?" And I said, "Actually, no. I think we'll leave it there." I actually like leaving an ending which is slightly ambiguous about whether it's a good ending or a bad ending, because it's kind of a litmus test for the reader. And also, I think it's an idea that you don't have this kind of neat closure, that science fiction should kind of be a continual opening out. So if you have an ending that's a closure, you're kind of going against what the science fiction mode should be. You should always leave it out to go like, and there's another thing, the famous Rendezvous with Rama Ending, which is, the Ramans always do things in 3s, which is like a 1-sentence thing that suddenly bang, oh, that's not the ending. There's more wonder to come, but you're not going to see that. Unfortunately, you then do see it rather reduced, in my opinion. But if only Clarke had not been tempted to follow that opening out, because it's a beautiful way of both ending a book and giving a little twist towards the fact that there's yet more cosmic wonder than we've seen, and we've already seen plenty of cosmic wonder in that book. So I kind of like now I'm kind of inclined, especially as one gets on, one thinks, well, is one old enough to pull off a trilogy these days? It's a lot of work, and the inevitable happen in the middle. This isn't great. So I'm a big fan, really, of doing single shot books. The last 2 have been single shots, and the 2 before that were a kind of trilogy, and they were both related. Something coming through and into everywhere. But I use my new principle of, if you're going to write a trilogy, miss out on the boring middle volume where you kind of trying to keep the balls in the air, but not indicate what the ending might be, not to give too much away. So the middle volume is always problematical, and my way of getting over that problem is just to miss it out.
Yes, a trilogy in 2 volumes, that's the ideal.
Yeah.
Yes. I've been looking back over the books of yours that I've read. It turns out that nearly all of them have been I think all of them so far have been the one-shot novels. I read Red Dust, I read Fairyland, The Secret of Life, Whole Wide World, which I reviewed for Foundation way back in 2002, Cowboy Angels, and now War of the Maps. And I know that I first saw, I mean, I do have at least the two of your space opera, solar system space opera, and I remember you talking about how you'd conceived that, the Gardens of the Sun one, where you were looking at a picture of one of the moons of Jupiter and imagining a little figure standing in the landscape looking at it. I think I read quite a few of your short stories as well. And I remember one, it actually had quite an impact on me at the time when I read it, way back in the 1980s, The King of the Hill. Because it was a beautiful little story in its own right, and it had a nice kind of, I don't know if it was intentional or not, a kind of echo of one of J.G. Ballard's most powerful stories, which is called The Killing Grounds. And they're both set in a...
Not thought of that before, but there you go. It's very possible. Very possible. You get these things in your head and then you can't remember where they came from and you're riffing off them. Yeah. I do know the story, yeah. That's the one, is it in Runnymede, I think?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Looking at your, some of the things you've written and said about writing, I do get the impression that you find, writing is a discovery process, that you have an idea of the book and you have a lot of background on world building and so on, but you find the story as you write it. Is that the way you work?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, you mentioned the sort of the Gardens of the Sun, there's Quiet War, which actually not a trilogy, it's 4 books and a bunch of short stories. And I started off with short stories thinking it's just kind of interesting to write about the outer solar system because not much has been written about it. And suddenly we had these probes bringing back actual landscapes, which is what I was kind of interested in. So you didn't have to make stuff, well, you did have to make stuff up a bit, but you didn't have to make up the landscape because there you had quite high resolution photographs of the moon's surfaces and starting to get ideas of their history, their geological history and so on, and the fact that they weren't just a bunch of very similar ice balls, but they're all kind of highly differentiated, each with their own particular history, which was reflected in their each particular landscape. So I was kind of interested in that, and so I kind of built it from the inside out. From that came the idea of why were people living there, and then from that came the sort of back history, which altered as I wrote the short stories and then changed again when I wrote the novels. So it was a fumbling around. And yes, it'd be a lot more helpful for me because it would be faster, I suppose, if I planned stuff out, but I'm kind of incapable. I've tried to do it and I'm kind of incapable of doing it to a certain extent. Some novels have resembled pretty much the plan. Other novels, you mentioned The Whole Wide World, that started out as just an exercise in writing a detective story. And so I just wrote a chapter a day, I think, until I finished out a rough draft and then just put it away. And it was a straightforward detective story until I suddenly realized, well, what about writing it as a near future detective story about surveillance, which back in the early part of this century was kind of a new thing. And then what would happen to surveillance? Would there be more surveillance if there was some kind of terrible country-changing terrorist incident? And coincidentally, it was published a few days after 9/11, 2001. So, oops, the future caught up with that one very quickly, and that kind of tells you a lesson. I mean, you've written near future stuff as well, Ken, so that's really difficult to kind of keep ahead. I mean, it's interesting because you can write about your interests about the present clearly and directly, as you've done in several novels. But on the other hand, there's this risk, and certainly at the moment, with the things going on around the world with COVID-19, there's a risk of some big thing coming along completely invalidating what you're writing. It swerves history in a sudden step change that messes up everything. So it's kind of comforting to, first of all, to write short stories to begin with, because you haven't lost much if there is this kind of step change. But also, I find it interesting just to build things up slowly rather than go in with a bang and try and work everything out from scratch. It would, as you say, make more sense to do that, but for some reason I'm constitutionally unable. I don't know, Ken, do you plan? Do you know what you're going to write when you write it, more or less? Do you know what the ending is going to be? Do you know where you're going?
Not always. I attempt to plan. I mean, I attempt at enormous and inordinate length to plan. And I don't always succeed, to be honest. A thing that kind of pushes you towards planning is that publishers and editors do like a synopsis. So writing a synopsis is an extremely painful part of the process,
yep.
in my experience. And I've only been able to do it by telling myself, look, this is all a pack of lies anyway. They're not going to object if you write a better story than this. You just have to sell them on the idea of it and give them the idea that you know where you're going, and they'll get something at the end of it and try and make it better. And in fact, I am working at the moment on bizarrely, a space opera trilogy. This was after swearing I would never write another trilogy after I'd done the Corporation Wars. And I got this idea partly out of moving back to the place where I grew up, well, very near the place where I grew up, Gourock on the Firth of Clyde, and seeing a lot of nuclear submarines going past, as one does. And on the other hand, rummaging through some of my old notes and ideas from when I was very young and not had far more ideas than I had either the experience or the ability to write. And I've long found that, you know, reading your premature speculations is actually quite a useful source as you get older. You mine your past notebooks. And I found this idea of sort of what if we had what if we got the science fictional faster than light travel, but got it fairly soon? And us, with all our stupidities and nation states and power blocks and all of that, went out to the stars and continued doing what we're doing. And I thought it was cool. And there was the kind of the coincidental thing that this was round about the year 2018, which is the year where James Blish's Cities in Flight starts.
Somebody does it? Is it
yeah.
Really? We've missed the anniversary.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. So when did you, was it 2018 when, if people don't know, this is where the Earth is, it's a Great Depression, isn't it? Huge depression. So the cities, coincidentally, there's an invention of this thing called the spin dizzy, I think it is.
Yes. Yeah, the spin dizzy is invented.
Anti-gravity device. And
yes.
You can attach it to cities and off they go into space as whole cities. So New York, Manhattan actually, isn't it? Which is kind of the centerpiece of the books that I remember, just takes off with bedrock and all up it goes. Yeah, fantastic. I didn't realize, was it 2018 when Manhattan lifted then? Gosh, it might be 2020 when it goes now, actually, the way things are going.
I think it's 2018 is the start of, is when it's invented. This is when the spin is invented. The cities taking off actually happened 1,000 years later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but there is still, it's still quite a, I mean, I reread it 2 or 3 years ago or maybe longer than that, to write a thing about it for SFX or something. And, you know, I still enjoy it. It's got some of the greatest eye kicks in science fiction, including, you know, New York taking off and the mayor of New York standing in a tower from which he guides the entire city, some old tower, which already exists, as it were.
Well, it's the Tower of City Hall, which is there
Yes,
now. Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So you can
Theology.
see the bridge, as it were, of Manhattan if you go visit. Yeah.
Yep. But so yes, this story starts with that. The funny thing is, as you were saying, how a near future event can really throw it, because I don't start it in the very near future, but say 50 years from now, and I have 3 different power blocks and so forth. And you know, the one thing I didn't want to happen was America having a revolution now, this year, and be well missed if the Americans rise up and overthrow capitalism and so on. It will just completely wreck my trilogy. But that's one of these unlikely events.
Well, we don't know how that's going to pan out, so it's pretty open in that. And it might just be like 1968, where stuff sort of went back to normal again, kind of. I mean, I think somebody said it's kind of like 1918 meets 1968 at the same time. I mean, you had that bizarre thing of the SpaceX rocket to ISIS going up at the same time as the riots starting, and it was just like this is deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra famously said. And you know, the cities are burning, yet Whitey's on the moon, famously, as
yeah.
I've forgotten who said it now. Just tisk. Anyway, the revolution will not be televised was another one of his as well, and it's completely skipped my mind to attribute that to, but never mind. It's I do remember, if you remember Apollo Summer, you know, it's the same kind of thing going on. There was still unrest. You didn't quite have the Watts riots, but still quite a lot of unrest, and it was exactly the same political divide that's causing the unrest now, except now we've got the added plague dimension as well, and an even worse president than Nixon in there as well. So yes, it's, as you say, it's a difficult time to do near future. So I don't know how you're going to come up with a resolution of that, Ken, but good luck. My next one's only set, as I said, War of the Maps is a few billion years in the future. So I don't care, you know, all this is trivial to me. But the next one's a mere less than a million years in the future, but still, so there's still a good distancing, I hope. One after that, in fact, the one I'm writing now is I'm kind of writing because I started at the beginning of the year fiddling around with 2 novels, and I laid one aside because it is a kind of near future one, and I just couldn't see a way of I could sort of see what's going to happen, and I couldn't see a way of incorporating that. I thought, is this going to be a small thing or a big thing? And I didn't know, and whatever happened, I suddenly thought, well, if this isn't a big thing, you know, COVID-19 was just twitching around in bits of China and so on at that stage. If this isn't a big thing, something like it may happen. So I'm going to have a rethink about that. So I did, and I still am, actually, which is a problem when you do kind of make things up as you go along. You're a bit more labile to stuff that's happening around you, which is a good thing in a way, because it means you're not so rigid in putting stuff, incorporating things, which is what I like, is not just discovering what the novel's about, but discovering relevant things around you, you know? Things suddenly start appearing, as it were, out of nowhere because your mind is attuned. I'm making mysterious signs on Zoom now, but your mind is attuned suddenly to, or is sensitive to what's important to the book and what isn't as you come into it. So you suddenly see things start popping out of the background that could be useful. And I wasn't at that stage with the book, so I set it aside because I thought I'm just going to get things hopelessly wrong, and it was kind of important. What was happening now was kind of important to where the novel was set, like 50 years down the line or whatever, because the past was important to the novel's future. So set it aside. And I'm sure there are lots of people in that situation, you know, and I feel for them. And I feel sorry for the contemporary novelists who are like, well, I'm going to have to start writing about 1968 or 1972 or something like that. You know, I can't write a contemporary novel. I can't even write a novel about 2020 at the moment. So things are tough all over. Write about the far future, or write about the. I mean, like you, I thought, what would happen if contemporary people had access to other planets in something coming through and into everywhere. So I decided to set in a kind of continuous present. So the continuous present wasn't the present when the book was published. It wasn't quite the present when the book was being written. It was just a present that was the present. And it was neither the present when the reader was going to read it. I mean, it slips into the past now, obviously. So I decided not to pin it to a particular year, to the great annoyance of my publisher, because science fiction publishers always like to put on the cover of the book, it's 2023, it's 2045, and, you know, it's an easy in to the novel. And I'm like, it's completely irrelevant, man, what year it is really. Up to a point, it's somewhere around then. And also it's a hostage to fortune, putting a date in.
Exactly. I think you several years ago, in some conversation or a panel indeed, you mentioned that your publisher had persuaded you to put a single date into one of your near future novels, White Devils, and it just happens to be the date on a tombstone. But you still felt uneasy about putting any date in, because it is as you say, a hostage to fortune. I actually took that very much to heart and didn't put dates in novels, as you know, in near future novels, if I could possibly avoid it. This was after, you know, I had written my first few near future novels and put in dates liberally. And the novels are fortunately still in print in some form or other, but they're completely outdated by the dates that are in them. The funny thing is, I got kind of caught out, but there was one novel I was writing, and I was trying to write it in the continuous present, because it was exactly as you just described. It was a novel that was supposed to be happening round about now, and oh great, I can just write a contemporary style novel, but I'll have this science fictional weirdness in it. And the novel, part of the setting of the novel was traveling to a tiny little republic or autonomous region on the borders of Georgia and Russia. And just as I was planning that, there was a war between Georgia and Russia over North Ossetia. And suddenly, North and South Ossetia, from being a sort of something I could hand wave about and say, it's a place like one of these, and everyone would nod wisely, suddenly became a place that every newspaper reader had heard of. So I was just kicking myself and chewing the carpet and so on while I was trying to figure out how I was going to incorporate this. And then I had the idea that I would simply set the novel as happening now in the immediate aftermath of the Russia-Georgia war. And that way I could even put in contemporary events. So that novel is very securely fixed, but fortunately in the past, in the science fictional date of 2008. Yeah, this, it is, I don't know how unusual it is to have to go from very near future to very far future. And you've done it quite a lot. I'm trying to think of other examples. I mean, I've done it, and I guess Stephen Baxter does it. I mean, Stephen Baxter does it.
Well, Stephen Baxter does it. I do it as a jump, and there's like this huge gap of, I'm not going to talk about the history, but Stephen Baxter does it from now, and here are the steps to where you get to year 55. He goes even farther in the future than almost the rest of us. I think Olaf Stapleton may be a bit, you know, up there with the stakes of how far can you go. But he does it so you can see every step. It's a continuous timeline, whereas mine's got gaps. Yours has probably got gaps as well. I like gaps. Gaps are useful, frankly, but or maybe it's just laziness. I don't know.
No,
but it's and he makes it in a way that's also useful to the plot as well. Everything fits in. I'm trying to think. I suppose the foundation novels are a bit like that as well. They have a sort of continuous narrative over great time spans, and I'm sure there are others as well. But you're right, it's quite rare. I like just chunking a bit of time. Here's the future, deal with it, you know. And then people can talk about their past and allude to it, various things. But I kind of like to keep things a bit loose.
yeah. One of the things that I noticed about in War of the Maps, there's some very slight, but I thought quite cunning little allusions to H.G. Wells.
Mm.
There's a few little sly nods to the master, founding father of British SF, and I really liked them, including a quite unexpected one to one of Wells's really creepy short stories, whose title kind of, I think it's called The Strange Case of Davidson's Eyes, about a guy who has a chemical accident, and he finds himself in a kind of other world where he sees what may or may not be ghosts. And it's a most peculiar, I may be mixing up 2 or 3 different stories.
I think that's the guy under anesthesia, under the knife, I think. Is it Under the Knife it's called?
That's it, yeah.
You get strange visions, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's that allusion there. There's the allusion to the invasion of the crabs story. There's a couple of other things as well that I've probably forgotten about. But yeah, there's a very faint ghost. So thank you for spotting it. There's a very faint ghost underlay. But we owe a lot to H.G. Wells as British science fiction writers anyway. So I always think we can't help but unconscious somewhere. If you look at British novels, you know, take them apart, there's going to be some little nugget at H.G. Wells, and he got there first with everything anyway, just about, with a lot of stuff. I mean, he wrote, you know, the Earth fiction, the time travel novel, the Travel to the Moon novel. Well, Vernon would argue against that, I guess, but he wrote, as you said, you know, the alien invasion novel. He got in there. The biotech goes. The Global War novel, etc., etc., etc. And he got in with the sort of posthumans, which is you know, a big thing now. But Wells was very keen on bettering oneself, bettering the species, sometimes in unfortunate ways that people had in the 1920s. So there's unfortunate overtones of eugenics, I think, sometimes, but that's kind of unfortunate fingerprint of that time, of people, sort of forward-thinking scientific people who are thinking of improving the race, and not so good now. I mean, part of sort of White Devils is complete reaction to all of that, you know, and I think a couple of your novels have that kind of ethical question as well, going back to another British science fiction writer, Mary. Well, is she or isn't she British science fiction, or is she really a Gothic novelist we've claimed? But Mary Shelley, who's Frankenstein, you know, is really about the ethics of creation rather than the science of creation. It's about responsibility of the creator, and so, you know, we're still talking about this stuff. So it's not, as I say, it's not surprising you can find a few traces, though these were conscious traces in War of the Maps. I mean, the title is a conscious reference, but I missed off the definitive article for reasons of not wanting to be too close.
Yes, it works. I think it does work. you and you started writing, or certainly started publishing, just about, your first stories came out before I had started writing seriously. And you're 1 year younger than me, or a couple. My first novel, I think your second, were contenders for the Clark that year in '95. And
I think my third, Ken, actually.
third,
Hateful
okay,
Rank.
sorry.
But it took me 3 novels to get to where you got to in 2. So there you go.
I didn't
Yeah.
mean it that way. And so
Anyway.
we're both well, you kind of were actually a practicing scientist. I was almost there, in that I ended up with an MPhil rather than a PhD, and I never did practice the art of being a scientist. So I did zoology, you did botany, and looking back, how do you feel that the field has changed over that, what seems a vast backward and abyss of time?
It is, isn't it? Very vast. But gee, I mean, I guess my early stuff, although actually I'm even more precocious than that, to be honest, because I had a short story accepted for publication when I was 19 by Worlds of If magazine, which nobody will remember now. And luckily, well, I didn't think that at the time, but luckily it went out of, the magazine crashed and burned. This was in 73, I think, which is a very long time ago. I could have been, a terrible wonderkind. It's a terrible short story, by the way, as well. So I was quite glad in the end. But a year later, I thought, thank goodness, I did save 2 lines from it that I then used in Eternal Light, my third novel, and I was sort of working on this weird future history, which very, very transmogrified. I then my first 3 novels and some short stories used as well, but in a very different form. And after a long gap of not writing anything, because you said I was doing a PhD, but gosh, what has changed? Well, for one thing, when I started out, there wasn't much in the way of a British science fiction scene. Interzone had just got started. I'd just come back from the States. There was this guy called Ian MacDonald, who was younger than both of us and was publishing before us as well. And he was getting published in Asimov's, and I think something called Extra, a magazine called Extra, which is Belfast, a local magazine of his. And but there wasn't much of a British science fiction scene. There wasn't much of a British novels coming. There weren't many new voices, Ken, basically, were there? Brian Aldiss was being published. There were other people who had been published. The New Worlds people around, Chris Priest and so on, obviously Michael Moorcock, and others. But there'd been like a gap of people wanting to be published. I don't know if you had that feeling as well. You had books, you said you were writing early, you were looking at your earlier stuff. I was as well, and then I binned most of it. I think the nearest I got to trying to get published was submitting a terrible novel. And I was 17 then, to give you an idea how terrible the novel was. Its only saving grace was the fact I finished it, to a glance competition that I think Gary Kilworth won.
Wow.
Yeah. It may have been Gary Kilworth, or Gary Kilworth won a later one. Anyway, but there wasn't much around in the early 1980s. And then Interzone came along, and I found an outlet for short stories there. I was being published in the States as well, for short stories, by the simple fact that I sent stories into American magazines. Secret superpower was pre-internet days that you could send stuff by post as a submission. And if you had the wherewithal for the very expensive return postage, and could work out the very strange labels and things that you needed for the 2 postal systems to interact. This is all pre-digital, kids. You could get stuff publish, maybe, if it was good enough. And so I was doing that. But Interzone was like, suddenly there was a community of writers and you can riff off each other. I remember going, and I wasn't really, I don't know about you, Ken, were you in the British fandom before you were a writer? Or was it something you kind of discovered when you got published?
Well, I was in, I didn't quite realize it at the time, but I was in a little corner of fandom in that when I was working at London Electricity in the late 80s, I found that working in IT, it was the only place where nearly everybody read SF. Yeah. And SF novels got passed around like cold viruses, you know, around the team, probably carrying flu virus as well for that. And we started a science fiction club, and I soon discovered that the main thing of science fiction fandom is that you meet every month and you talk about everything except science fiction. Yeah. And at one point we ventured to the 3 Tons or whatever it was, whatever the big pub was in the south of London that had the monthly meetup of London fandom, and we saw awe-inspiring figures like David Langford and a silversmith called Sylvia Starshine, I think her name was, who made some Hugo plinths or rockets for all I know. And we were very shy newbies, and I don't think we repeated the experiment. So I was kind of very peripherally in fandom, but I only went in. I landed in SF, organized SF fandom at the deep end with the 1995 Glasgow Worldcon, which is where my first novel was launched. And I think, I'm not sure if it was there that I first met you. I remember you and Kim Newman coming into a pub, carrying on like a couple of 18th century fops and speaking.
Oh dear.
You were great. It was just such fun, and yeah, it was so great to meet SF writers, and also to meet fans, and finding, you know, there were far more of us than I'd ever suspected. Anyway, sorry, you were saying.
Well, no, you had the same experience I did. It wasn't until I went to a convention that I really knew or discovered, wow, you know, there's all this other stuff going on around science fiction. There's a huge fan. And so mine was Brighton in whenever it was, 87, was it, Brighton, the first? Anyway, and my first novel, 400 Billion Stars, wasn't quite out, but had been bought by Gollancz, by Malcolm Edwards, who coincidentally was one of the organizers of, or not coincidentally, one of the organizers of the Brighton Worldcon. So I went along, and that's when I met some of the Interzone people, and the people I knew. I first met Kim Newman there, David Pringle, the editor of Interzone at the time, I met there. I can't remember if probably didn't meet John Clute there actually, but a bunch of other people. Scott Bradfield, whose short stories I really loved from Interzone, are these weird, not quite science fiction, but not quite mainstream, or if you want to call it stories either, of kind of fantastical LA. And I just been living in LA in the early 80s, so they had a kind of resonance with me anyway, and a bunch of other people as well. So yes, it's very odd suddenly becoming part of this community, because I was just basically a young guy with a typewriter and access to a photocopier, which is another secret magical power you needed as an author in those days. And that's how I did things, by post. Although I was a member of the BSFA, and so once I started getting publishing, so there's ads in the back of Interzone, so I joined that as well. And I was part of a round robin group that criticized each other's short stories while I was trying to get published. And we did meet several of us who lived in Oxford. I was in Oxford at the time. I met as well. But it was like 4 or 5 people, that was it. So there's interestingly similar parallel experience to you in that neither of us came up through fandom, which is kind of the traditional one of the traditional routes. But, and I don't know, when I was a kid, I basically just read everything in the library. That's what I did. I didn't have anybody else to talk to about this stuff. Some of the kids in school, like 2001 was the book that's being handed around at one point, and then it became Papillon. I remember there was this weird thing in schools that you'd have a fad for a book. Book of the year, which everybody read, you know. So it's 2001 when 2001 came out. And then it was Papillon, and then I can't remember what happened after that. It was something else. But I was a kid who read all the other stuff. I mean, there were a few other kids like me, but I was a kid who we had a very good school library, and I read my way through all the little science fiction that was there. But I also found lots of stuff like William Golding, Mary Renauld, whose history books taught me a lot about how to get a weird culture across in the minimum amount of description. Which is basically just anything the character interacts with, you talk about, and anything they don't interact with, you don't. Which is a very great rule. Except that I do break it because I do love info dumps as well. So, but in more of the maps, I observe the Mary Renault rule basically. So we talk about, it's very focused on what the character sees and what he thinks about of the world, and also he's wandering through a new country, so he doesn't know half of it, so a lot of it is supposition on his part and how things work and how weird it is. So we share his wonder, estrangement partly as well. And then it gets really weird when he leaves, you know, the map that they know to head out towards where the infection seems to be coming from, because it's on the outside of a Dyson sphere. It's like space travel in a way. And that harks back to another James Blish short story, The One in the Puddle, whose title I've forgotten. The Sudden Realization of Scale. Yes. What's that one called? It's
Sunken Universe is one, or it's also called Surface Tension.
Surface Tension, that's it. Yeah, that's the one. That's what I know it by, and it's basically about. It's one of his pantropy stories, isn't it? Pantropy is a word he made up for adapting human beings to exotic alien landscapes where ordinary human beings couldn't survive. Which is a great idea. And this is about people who find themselves stranded on a puddle world. So they adapt their children to live in puddles. They make them microscopic. So they live amongst the amoeba and so on and so forth. And then they discover the engraved tablets that have been left behind for them, and work out how to build a spaceship, which is basically built of wood and diatoms powering it, and so on and so forth. And they move from one puddle to another puddle. And there's this great image, really getting away from talking about books, but I want to talk about this because it's sort of one of my central science fiction images that when I read as a kid, and I've kept with me. And it's kind of one of those things that you want to not necessarily recreate, but you want to get the same wow factor as this little wooden spaceship is traversing from one puddle to the next over about a meter or something like that. It stops being day and the stars come out overhead, and we know what they are, but the people in the spaceship can't even see them. So they get this doubling of scale, their scale, which is this enormity of moving from one puddle to another, and the actual enormity of the universe, of the fact that they're traversing this tiny bit of a world, and overhead there's the vastness of the universe. And this sudden sort of pull out, this sudden change in scale is something which I think is the trigger of a sense of wonder. And so it's something I kind of want to capture. And so War of the Maps has this thing where this guy's walking for long distances from one country to another in his little map, which is one of the smallest maps on this Dyson sphere. It's basically the size of Australia. It's not planet size. It's if you skin Europa or something like that. And laid it out. And then suddenly they have to do this huge voyage across tens of thousands of leagues. It's like traveling to Mars. So I wanted kind of that scale change as well. So the novel opens out in that way. So you go from this sort of fantasy journey, which is entirely muscle powered, to this other journey, which requires a different tone of technology, and a kind of dreadnought spaceship in this vast ocean. And but that goes back to this reading this James Blish story, Service Tension. And I've always thought, you know, everybody has this kind of prime spark of these influence. When people ask you about influences, I just think, well, it's not so much an influence, it's a spark. It's a moment as a reader. And that's how we all start out as writers, as readers. It's this moment where you think, wow, you know, and that was my wow moment, was reading that story. So that's where I got my interest in science fiction. I was just going through all this stuff, randomly reading everything, and not quite omnivorous, not quite devouring everything, because I had blocks like E. Smith I couldn't get on with. I read 2 sentences by him and thought, my mind is going, I'm going to lose my intelligence if I read any more of this clunky stuff. Bless him, because apparently there is some great stuff in it, but it was just so clunky I could get on with it. So there was that barrier there, and there were a couple of others I won't mention as well. But there were kind of tons of writers I really enjoyed. But that was I was reading in the 70s, a new, again, back to your question of how things have changed. So I started out as a new wave reader, I think. I thought, suddenly when I found these anthologies, not the magazine itself, because I was a bit too young to find the magazine, the printed magazine that Morcott was editing, but the New World's Quarterlies, they were coming out with kind of followed on these paperbacks. There were 10 of them. Yes, and I do have them all, but I got them as they came out, except for one, which I got later on. And there was a different kind of fiction from the fiction I've been reading before. And yeah, there was all this inner space stuff and Ballardian as well. But it was basically better written. It was punchier. It had more of a point, and it had more of a kind of, although, you know, the old science fiction is supposed to be ideas, it did explore ideas in a more interesting human way. So that's how I got turned on by that. And then Interzone came along. And at the same time, in the 70s, was when a lot of women started writing science fiction, or becoming more visible as science fiction writers as well. So just like and Joanna Russ, and I guess James Tiptree, although she was more 70s junior, this kind of mysterious figure, this CIA operative who disguised herself as a man to write science fiction and then got outed. But there are people like Pamela Sargent, Susan McGee-Charnas, published by Glance. All these people I was finding, you know, this kind of people, and so they were writing for a kind of political slant, because as a woman, how would you not? So suddenly that became interesting as well. And then so the 80s came along with Interzone, and after that we had the kind of the explosion in the 90s, didn't we? And the new space opera, which I was kind of a part of. And then it all got weird after that. And now, you know, when I started, and probably when you started as well, there was this idea that you could read just about everything. In fact, there was worry that I was going to run out of stuff to read. You know, even going back and mining the old stuff. It was this fear that it was limited. You know, the event horizon was visible. You know, and suddenly now it's become this enormous thing, and not just in written as well. You know, the one thing that I think has changed it is it's become not just in television and film, where it is the dominant. Certainly in television, definitely, but all the big blockbusters in film have been science fictional. And you can argue about whether they're great or not, but they have, you know, huge fan following, so they're hugely influential. And they have their own eye kicks as well. You know, the Star Wars with the spaceship coming over right at the opening, and it keeps coming. You know, so you have that. But the written word as well. There's just vast amounts of stuff that's impossible now to keep up, and so many outlets for short stories, and it's sort of dividing up into these polders now, isn't it, of interests around different things. So it's sort of split, so it's no longer as unified as it was, but then again it's no longer as sort of a monocultural, monosexual, monochrome. And in there somewhere as well was cyberpunk, I suppose, as well. So Interzone and cyberpunk were about when I was trying to get published. And I was still interested in kind of the old space opera. My first novel definitely kind of reflects that. You know, although it also reflects my impatience with it and with the Americanism of the future as well, which I think, again, you were reacting against as well quite a lot, weren't you?
Sure. Yeah. The way that the way that I got into science fiction was, I remember very much that in Greenock's public library, probably in the junior library, I came across a book called Rocket to Limbo by Alan E. Nurse. And that was my first exposure to all those golden age tropes of generation ships, light travel, telepathy, psi powers, etc. And my, that moment in surface tension was certainly, you know, something that stuck in my mind too way back then. But I think the wow moment that I recall from Rocket to Limbo was the people walking up the ramp of a starship are walking down the ramp, and they were, you know, fishermen from another world and with jangling earrings and stuff like that. People who are kind of exotic in our limited terms, but who you were nevertheless sort of traveling about. And you see something almost like, I mean, we know now that it's a literary effect, that you take sort of something from an age of adventure and glamour, and you put it into a new technological contest, or what we look back on as an age of glamour, and you get odd effects. One of the books I've been reading recently, which is a big book, is Moby Dick. Moby Dick's a very science fictional book. He has a wonderful thing about how, you know, in the streets of Boston, I think it was, you can meet what he calls, in the language of his day, you know, heathen cannibals standing on street corners chatting. It's enough to make a stranger stare. And it's, and also the sense of the deep sea voyages, the long ocean voyages, and we can work on that in relation to space travel, often very misleadingly, as Charlie Stross has pointed out. But yeah, I read a lot of the classic stuff when I worked my way around the junior library, then the grown-up library, then the branch libraries, and worked like every buddy of our generation, SF reader of our generation remembers, going around the library picking out the yellow-spined Gollancz paperbacks with the SF at the bottom. So I worked my way from Asimov to Zelazny via, you know, most of the big names of that day, and then kind of branched out. And this point about the Americanness of the future and the monotony of the future and the imperial assumptions of the future and all of that were annoying me. They were beginning to annoy me. I know my friend Ian Banks was annoyed about them. And we both, you know, just jumped on the New World's quarterly paperbacks and read them avidly, and read Mike Harrison's excoriating essays and reviews, and John
Yes.
Cleat, very, very intellectually and linguistically challenging articles, and they had a profound effect on us, because we were discontented with something in American SF, but at the same time we were discontented with something in British SF, which was a sort of bleakness and narrowness. I do think that by the time New Worlds came along and the early issues of Interzone, there was something I wanted to push against in that. And at first, you know, to begin with, I thought it was something that you could only find in American SF. But actually, it was what I think of as the true British SF tradition, which is the deep time, the humanity seen in the evolutionary perspective as a species among other species. One that has, you know, no special role other than what it can make for itself, nothing written down for it, and no destiny. And this powerful sense of deep time, I think, what was there to be found. And once Interzone hit its stride and started casting about for what they call radical hard SF, and they more or less conjured up that the British, I think they conjured up the British boom by what they asked for, because there were writers who wanted to, like yourself, like Steve Baxter, who did want to, fill that gap. And Ian's first space operas were very much, I think they did contribute to that sense of opening out, that suddenly British SF was really exciting again.
Yeah, there were definitely a sort of displacement of the focus, of the centrality, and the kind of, as you say, the destiny, the inevitable destiny as our star stuff. You had these aliens and the culture of aliens as well, sort of out there already. This entirely, it seems to me, entirely imagined, because Ian thought all this stuff out, didn't he, before he even wrote the books? This sort of utopia, entirely fully imagined utopia, which is a really difficult thing to do, but it's fully imagined technical utopia as well. As opposed to kind of the rural utopias, which is another British thing from the, as Wells was writing, you had all the other people writing these kind of, let's get back to medieval times stuff because things were better then. Yeah, sure, if you're upper class, obviously, but that'll do it. Tough on everybody else. But I think at the same time as you, and it was kind of because of the kind of hippie trail and the things like I was too young to participate in it, but a lot of writers and cheap air travel suddenly became, in the late 60s, early 70s. So suddenly people could go to the other places. And there was kind of this exoticism coming out. And you didn't have to join the merchant marine like Ted Sturgeon or Jack Vance to experience it. You could backpack your way around Greece and Turkey, which is what Samuel R. Delany did. And I got my hit of exoticism from Nova, from the first few pages of Nova, in exactly the same way. Here was this world with other people, who weren't anything like the people we knew around. I mean, I've come from a small town anyway, but and one of the reasons I was reading science fiction was to escape that sort of suffocating small town feeling. But it was like, no, these aren't like any people on Earth, as far as I know. They were composites of all different stuff as well. They were genuine star gypsies kind of thing as well. It was like, what if you had a star? What would people look like if you had a star-faring civilization? But what would they look like at the sort of underclass, the kind of sailor class, which is Mouse and all of the other people were from, who were recruited by Lork Van, whatever his name was, the upper class guy, to go on the Grail quest. But it was kind of very interesting to see science fiction from that point of view, from the point of view of the workers, as it were. Give me a minute.
Yeah,
and I don't think that could have been done in the 50s, where like tough science fiction, there was like the noir generation come back from the war. You had these battle-hardened 25-year-olds like Fred Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth, who, Cyril Kornbluth was, I think, excuse me, was in the Battle of the Bulge. It's one of the worst places to be in the Second World War in the European theatre anyway. Brian Aldiss was fighting in Burma, which is not great either. So you had that viewpoint of people coming back and looking at what was going on in their country and wanting something new, which is what we had in 1945 in Britain. We had this. Churchill was kicked out. He won the war, but then no, thanks Churchill, bye.
Yes.
We want something better. We want the National Health Service. We want housing for all, and all the rest of these wonderful dreams that have vanished, more or less. But that's kind of interesting. So I was reading that stuff, and then And it was interesting that Aldous and Fred Pohl also actually got the new wave. I mean, he published Dahlgren, which is the new wave novel. It's like the epitome of the new wave. And that's it. You know, you can't get more new wavy than that. And that's Samuel R. Delany, which still, I think, you know, sums up what's wrong with America. You know, it's New Orleans after the flood, it's Minneapolis after the riots, and everybody's left, and so on. You know. And with added weirdness. So you had all that as well. So it's kind of a lucky time as a reader to be in science fiction, because you kind of the intersection of this kind of tough noir, 50s giving way to the ebullience and the 1960s, the new wave. And then as a writer, you know, cyberpunk came along. I mean, the first part of the 80s was pretty dull, but then cyberpunk came along and jazzed everything up all over again. And now everything's gone very weird indeed, and everything is happening everywhere. There is no center, as there used to be. You know, there's lots of little revolutions happening everywhere. You know, Afro-punk or whatever. You know, solar punk, all the other punks, all the young punks. So yeah, fun times.
Yes, I think we've just been asked by,
I think we have, yeah,
our good lady Anne to wrap it up. So I'll thank you, Paul, enormously for this conversation, and you know, look forward to meeting in real life or through screens at some time again before too long. And we've been talking about Paul's book, War of the Maps. We've talked about his background and career.
There we go. I don't know if has that reversed for everybody, because it's reversed for me, but that might be a Zoom thing.
No, I can see it straight.
All right. Well, the weird thing is, if I look on my little Zoom screen, it's a mirror image. So I'm in a parallel universe, or I'm through the mirror, folks, with this. And we've also got Ken's sort of switch in direction, really, with your Selkie book. Although you've got marine biologist in it, so we didn't have time to talk about that. But so yeah, hold that up as well, Ken. Come on, product placement.
Yes, my little novella, my foray into paranormal romance set on the Isle of Skye, a place I know fairly well. Yeah. But thanks, but we really do have to wrap up. So we can agree that we live in interesting times, and I'm getting more interesting by the week. So if nothing else, some very interesting science fiction is going to come out of it if we get through this.
And at some point where we'll be able to meet up again and talk about it face to face, rather than on this wonderful internet video phone thingy, which we're doing. Yeah. How futuristic my young self would have thought this.
Yes, it is amazing.